Don't embarrass me at my own rehearsal dinner, Renata. Sit at the kids' table where you belong. My mother snapped the words across the patio like she was correcting a waiter, and the citronella torches lit up every face turning to stare at me. She had a seating chart in her hand, laminated, color-coded, and she dragged her manicured finger down to a table near the bar where two of my cousin's children were coloring on the tablecloth with crayons. That was my assigned seat. 38 years old, and I'd been seated with the children because, in her words, I didn't have a +1 worth showing off. I didn't move yet. I stood there in the navy dress I'd bought specifically because it didn't draw attention, because for one night I'd hoped to just disappear into a corner and watch my younger sister get married without becoming the evening's entertainment. My mother had other plans. She always did. "This family doesn't run on charity cases," she said, loud enough for my sister's future in-laws to hear over the string quartet. "Lindsay worked for everything she has. You work for the county. There's a difference, sweetheart, and everyone here knows it." My stepfather, Roger, chuckled into his scotch like she'd told a clever joke. My sister, Lindsay, radiant in her white rehearsal dress, didn't even look over. She'd heard this routine 100 times. Nobody at that table, and there were 60 people at that table easily, said a single word in my defense. For 11 years, I had been quietly paying off my mother's house in Charleston. Every mortgage statement that came to her door, paid in full, routed through an account she had no idea existed, funded by combat pay and hazard pay, and a security clearance she thought meant I stapled folders for a living. Tonight, the daughter who said nothing finally had nothing left to give. I didn't sit at the kids' table. I set down my wine glass on the linen, walked past my mother without a word, and pulled my federal credentials out of my clutch. I crossed the patio to where my driver was waiting, at the edge of the property, a man named Holt who'd been instructed to stay out of sight unless I signaled him. I signaled him. He spoke into his sleeve, and 40 seconds later, two black SUVs rolled up the gravel drive of the vineyard my mother had spent 18 months' salary renting out for this wedding. My mother's face went the color of the tablecloths. "What in God's name is happening? Did you call the police on us? On your own sister's wedding?" The lead agent walked straight to me, not to her, and said, "Director Hale, we're ready when you are." The silence that followed was the kind you could hear your own heartbeat in. If you've ever had a parent who only saw your value in dollar signs and a seat at the bar table, hit like right now. Because to understand how I got to that vineyard with two federal vehicles waiting for me, you need to go back 4 months, to a Sunday dinner in May that I should have walked out of and didn't. It was Mother's Day, and I'd driven 3 hours from DC to my mother's house in Charleston because she'd texted that it would mean a lot if I came. I should have known better. I'd just come off a 16-hour shift coordinating a financial fraud takedown that had frozen $40 million in dirty assets tied to a shell network out of Miami, and I was running on protein bars and bad coffee, but I drove down anyway, because some part of me still wanted to believe that showing up would change something. It didn't. My mother answered the door in a robe, looked at my rental sedan in the driveway, and said, "You couldn't borrow something nicer for one day? Roger's clients are coming." Then she turned and walked back inside without hugging me. Inside, the dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and money. Lindsay was there with her fiancé Theo, a man who ran a boutique real estate firm and talked about cap rates the way other men talked about football. Roger's business partners were there with their wives, 12 people total, all seated around a table set with the good china. The china that came out exactly twice a year, for Easter and for whenever Roger needed to perform generosity for an audience. I sat at the end, near the kitchen door, in the spot reserved for whoever was least worth impressing. There was no place card with my name on it. There was a folding chair pulled in from the patio. My mother carved the chicken and gave the first cut, the best cut, to Theo. "For the man who's about to make an honest woman out of my baby," she said, beaming. Theo laughed like it was charming. Lindsay glowed. When the platter came around to me, there were 2 pieces of chicken left, both dark meat, both the dry ends near the bone. My mother handed it to me with a tight smile. "Lean meat is better for your knees anyway. You're not getting any younger, Renata." Roger's business partner, a man named Doyle, leaned across the table and asked me, not unkindly, "And what is it you do exactly?" Before I could answer, my mother cut in. "She does paperwork. Federal benefits processing, I think. Very stable, very boring." She said it the way you'd describe a filing cabinet. Doyle nodded politely and spent the rest of the meal talking to Roger about his golf handicap. After dinner, Roger handed Theo the keys to a brand new truck, a graduation gift, he called it, even though Theo had graduated business school 6 years earlier. My mother cried real tears watching Theo hug him, the kind of tears she'd never once produced for me. Then she reached into the hutch drawer and pulled out a small stack of coupons, rubber banded together, and slid them across the table to me. "I clipped these for you. There's one for canned soup, and one for that discount grocery store you probably shop at. Some might be expired, but you can usually still talk the cashier into it if you act sweet enough. My niece, Lindsay's stepdaughter from a previous relationship, 8 years old and already fluent in the family's particular cruelty, looked at the coupons in my hand and asked her mother, loud enough for the table, "Is Aunt Renata poor?" Nobody corrected her. Roger's partner Doyle smiled into his napkin. Under the table, I pulled out my secure phone and opened the banking app I wasn't supposed to need to check in front of anyone. There it was. An automatic transfer of $6,200 scheduled to process on the 1st of the month, quietly covering the mortgage on the house I was currently sitting in, being handed expired coupons in. 11 years of combat zone pay and hazard differential, routed through a trust my mother didn't know existed, keeping the lights on in a house where I wasn't worth a clean fork. My thumb hovered over the screen. Not yet, I told myself. Not like this. I put the phone away and finished my glass of water in silence. Before I left that night, my mother caught my arm at the door and told me the final piece of the plan for the wedding. "You'll help carry things at the venue the day before: linens, centerpieces, the cake stands. Theo's groomsmen shouldn't have to lift anything before the big day. And frankly, sweetheart, it'll give you something useful to do." Then, almost as an afterthought, "And wear something plain to the rehearsal dinner. We don't need you drawing eyes away from your sister." I drove back to Washington that night with the windows down and the radio off, replaying 11 years of my life like a tape stuck on loop, the house I funded. The startup loan I'd quietly wired Theo's firm 2 years earlier when a deal nearly collapsed, and he'd been one missed payment from losing his license. Money he believed came from a silent investor he'd met at a networking mixer, never once suspecting it was his future sister-in-law, moving liquid assets through a blind account at 2 in the morning between briefings. The therapy bills for my mother's nerves that I'd paid for 6 years running. The Christmas gifts that magically appeared under the tree with Roger's name on the card. I am, on paper, a benefits coordination specialist. That's the job title on file with my family, the one that lets me disappear into the background of every conversation at every dinner table I've ever sat at. What's actually on file with the federal government is different. I am the director of a joint financial crimes task force that operates out of an unmarked building 2 blocks from the Capitol, the kind of office that doesn't have a sign on the door, the kind of clearance that requires a different badge for every floor. I didn't get there by accident. I got there after 4 years active duty as a military intelligence officer, 2 deployments, a knee that aches before it rains, and a closed-door commendation ceremony nobody in my family was invited to because I never told them it happened. I got there by being underestimated in every room I ever walked into, starting at my mother's dinner table and learning to use it. Back in Washington that night, I badged into the office at 11 p.m. Because the financial fraud case was still hot, and because I didn't want to sit alone in my apartment with what had just happened. The night duty officer, a sharp 26-year-old named Priya, looked up from her terminal and said, "Didn't expect you tonight, ma'am. Thought you had the family thing." "I had the family thing," I said, and left it there. I went into my office, the one with the frosted glass and the flag in the corner, and I sat at my desk and pulled the file I kept in the bottom drawer, the one that wasn't part of any case. It held copies of every wire transfer I'd made to my mother and Roger, and now Theo over 11 years, $1,140,000 told, every cent of it dressed up as something else so none of them would ever know who it really came from. It held a folder of letters I'd written my mother from 2 deployments, sealed, mailed, never acknowledged. I'd found out 3 years after the fact that she'd used most of them as kindling for the fire pit during a dinner party because she needed scrap paper and didn't want to walk to the recycling bin. A neighbor mentioned it to me at a funeral, not realizing it would land like a blade. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon I kept in the credenza for nights exactly like this one and looked at the numbers until they blurred. At 6 the next morning, the office lit up. A flag came across 3 screens at once, a coordinated funds movement tied to a sanctioned foreign entity, routed through a regional bank holding company based in, of all places, Charleston, South Carolina, less than 4 miles from my mother's house. The kind of operation that, left alone another 72 hours, would have quietly laundered 9 figures through small-town accounts before vanishing into a network we'd never trace again. I called an emergency briefing. I stood at the head of a table with 11 analysts and said the words I'd said 100 times before in calmer rooms. "We move now, or we lose it." I authorized a full asset freeze and pulled in 2 partner agencies. By 9 a.m., we had agents in 3 states. My personal phone buzzed against the table. A text from my mother. "Reminder, wear the navy dress to rehearsal, not the green one. It competes with the bridesmaids. And please don't bring up your job if anyone asks. Just say you're in administration. We don't need a repeat of Easter." I was, at that exact moment, directing federal agents through a financial interdiction operation 40 minutes from her front door. And she was managing my wardrobe and my vocabulary for an audience of her husband's clients. Before I could set the phone down, it rang. She didn't say hello. First, did you request the days off properly this time, or are we going to have a repeat of your cousin's graduation? Second, you're helping carry the centerpieces and the cake stands at the venue Thursday, by hand, not on a cart, because Theo's groomsmen have their tuxedo fittings and can't risk pulling something. Third, you are not to order anything off menu at the rehearsal dinner, they're billing per head, and your sister doesn't need to explain to Theo's parents why the seafood tower ran short. Fourth, you're on duty with the Flower Girls Friday night so the rest of us can actually enjoy the welcome party. She rattled it off like a checklist with my name stapled to the bottom of every line. I might have a work conflict, I said, flat, careful. She laughed, actually laughed. It's paperwork, Renata. Nobody's career ends because you missed a Tuesday. I swear, you're the only person I know who acts like stapling forms is national security. My supervisor on that call, sitting 2 feet away, was a retired 3-star general named Donovan Marsh who had once walked into a hostile negotiation in Kandahar with nothing but a translator and his own nerve and walked out with 4 hostages and 0 shots fired. I bit down hard enough to taste copper and said nothing. I closed the phone. I went back to work. By that afternoon, 3 accounts were frozen, 2 arrests were pending, and the operation had a name and a case number that would outlive every wedding centerpiece my mother had ever obsessed over. 2 days later, I stood at attention in Marsh's office while he flipped through my op-tempo file for the week, cross-referencing it against my approved leave requests. He stopped on a printed itinerary. My mother had emailed it to my work account by mistake, the one meant for my boring job, listing out wedding duties hour by hour including Renata, linens plus cake stands. Thursday, do not let her near the seating chart. He set the paper down slowly. Director, what exactly is this? I told him everything. The 11 years, the mortgage, the loan I'd floated Theo's firm, the coupons, the folding chair at Easter, the letters burned for kindling, the seating chart that put me at a table with 8-year-olds at my own sister's wedding because I didn't have a plus worth showing off. Marsh didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he was quiet long enough that I could hear the building's HVAC humming through the vents. Then he said, I have watched you walk into rooms with armed men who wanted you dead and talk them into putting the weapons down. I have watched you take a debrief 12 hours after a blast concussion because you refused to leave your team short-staffed. And you're telling me you let your own mother put you at the kids' table. He stood and put both hands on my shoulders, which he had done exactly once before, the day I made director. Blood is not the same thing as loyalty, he said. Your family is staring at gold and calling it scrap metal because they never bothered to check the hallmark. You've spent your whole career protecting people who will never know your name. It's time you stop protecting people who know exactly who you are and choose to humiliate you anyway. He picked up his secure line and called the regional field office in Charleston directly. He arranged a security detail to be staged near the venue for the wedding weekend. Standard protocol, he said, given the active case I was running with ties to that exact county, and given that as director I was, technically, a protected asset whenever I was inside a jurisdiction tied to an open operation. Then he opened his desk drawer and handed me a black credential wallet with a federal seal stamped in gold. You are not carrying centerpieces in a parking lot like hired help, director. You are not skipping protective coverage because your mother doesn't want you near the seating chart. Hold your ground this weekend. That's not a request. I drove to Charleston that Thursday in my own car, alone, and carried the cake stands exactly as instructed, because I had decided the moment to draw the line wasn't going to be over folding chairs and dry chicken. It was going to be on my terms, in front of everyone, when it would actually mean something. Thursday afternoon, my mother stood at the venue entrance directing the unloading like a field general, snapping at me to keep the linens off the gravel and reminding me twice that Theo's parents were old money, real old money, and that I needed to tone myself down so I didn't embarrass anyone with too much conversation. Roger didn't lift a single box. He stood near the bar sampling the signature cocktail and telling Doyle about his golf handicap. My sister floated through in white linen, untouched by any of it, the way she'd floated through every family gathering of her entire life. Friday, the welcome party, I was assigned to the Flower Girls exactly as promised, while my mother and Lindsay and Theo's whole extended family sat under string lights with champagne. I didn't argue. I watched 2 6-year-olds chase fireflies for 3 hours and thought about the file in my bottom desk drawer. Saturday, the rehearsal dinner, was when she put me at the kids' table in front of 60 people and called paying my own way through life a charity case. That's when I stood up, walked past her, and signaled Holt. The 2 SUVs that rolled up the gravel drive weren't theater. They were my actual detail, staged exactly where Marsh had ordered them, here because of an active case with ties 4 miles from this exact vineyard. But I'd be lying if I said some part of me hadn't been waiting all weekend, for the moment I could let them be seen. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man named Castillo, crossed the patio, and addressed me the way he addressed me every single day of my professional life. "Director Hale, ma'am, we're staged and ready whenever you need to move." My mother's champagne flute slipped from her hand and shattered against the patio stone. "Director? Director of what? What is happening?" Her voice cracked across syllables I'd never once heard her use on me. Confusion, and underneath it, the first flicker of fear. Roger went pale and set down his scotch like it had suddenly turned to acid in his hand. Theo's father, a silver-haired man who ran a regional bank, stood up from his seat with the specific posture of someone who has just realized he's been sitting 2 tables away from somebody important the entire weekend. "This is my daughter," my mother said, scrambling, voice rising into something bright and brittle. She works in administration. Federal administration. We're so proud of her, of course, we're a very patriotic family. "Ma'am, I'll need you to step back," Castillo said to her, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a man who had said that sentence to 1,000 people who didn't believe it applied to them. "But I'm her mother," she said. "I raised her. Everything she has because of me." I looked at her over Castillo's shoulder, and for the first time in my life, I let the silence stretch as long as it wanted to. 11 years ago, I said, loud enough for the whole patio, I started paying the mortgage on your house, every month, quietly. While you told your friends I worked in paperwork and gave me dry chicken and expired coupons and made me carry cake stands like hired help, so Theo's groomsmen wouldn't have to risk a hangnail before their fitting. Lindsay's face went white. Theo turned to look at his fiancée like he was seeing the family for the first time. "I funded Theo's firm 2 years ago when it was 4 weeks from collapse," I said, and watched Theo's jaw drop open. "You never asked where that money came from. Nobody did. You just assumed it would always be there, the way the lights stay on and the mortgage gets paid and the daughter sits quietly at whatever table you put her at." "Renata, please," my mother started. "You burned my letters for kindling," I said. "You put me at a table with children at my own sister's wedding because you said I wasn't worth showing off. So no, keep the seat by the bar. It suits how you've always treated the people who actually held this family up." I turned and walked toward the SUVs with Castillo falling into step beside me, the rest of the detail closing in around the perimeter the way they'd been trained to. And I didn't look back at the sound of my mother's voice cracking apart behind me, calling my name across 60 stunned guests and a shattered champagne flute on the stone. By the time I landed back in Washington 2 days later, the story had already moved through the family group chat without me. Theo's father had pulled his firm's informal backing from Theo's company within 48 hours, unwilling to be associated with a family that had apparently been hiding a federal financial crimes director at the kids' table for over a decade. The optics, he said, were simply untenable for a man in his position. Doyle texted Roger asking, in a screenshot someone forwarded to me without my asking, whether any of this was going to come back on his own accounts, given how close he'd sat to me at that dinner. My mother's garden club committee quietly removed her as event chair the following week, citing scheduling concerns that fooled absolutely nobody. My phone filled with messages, my mother 40 or 50 of them, oscillating between fury and groveling within the same hour. Theo, asking if there was any way I could smooth things over with his father, as if 11 years of dry chicken were a paperwork error I could fix with a phone call. Lindsay, just one message, 3 days late. "Did you have to do that at my wedding?" I didn't write paragraphs back. I didn't explain myself or my pain or my 11 years of silence. I opened my banking app and canceled the standing transfer to my mother's mortgage account. 4 taps, the $6,200 monthly payment that had kept her roof over her head, halting mid-cycle for the first time in over a decade. Then I blocked her number. I blocked Roger, I blocked Theo, I left Lindsay's message unanswered for exactly as long as it took me to decide. I didn't owe her a reply either, not that week, maybe not ever. I went back to work. There was a financial crimes case to close out, briefings to give, a knee that ached worse than usual from 3 days standing on cobblestone in heels I never should have worn. None of it cared what had happened on that patio. The work never does, and there's something steadying in that. On the last evening before I flew out for a follow-up briefing in Charleston tied to the case, I drove past the vineyard on the highway without meaning to, the long fence line catching the last of the sunset, and I didn't feel the pull I expected to feel. I felt the particular kind of quiet that comes after you've finally put something down that you've been carrying so long your shoulders forgot what it was like to stand up straight. Family isn't the people who share your blood and hand you the dry end of the chicken. It's the people who notice when you're carrying too much and tell you to set it down. I spent 11 years being the second kind of daughter for people who only ever wanted the first kind of money, and I am done apologizing for finally choosing myself at a table where for once, nobody got to tell me where to sit.